Puzzle of the empty north. Australia's northern half forms one of the most striking anomalies in global settlement. Stretching thousands of kilometers along warm seas and sitting at the same latitude as some of the world's busiest population centers, it remains sparsely inhabited. Just across the Arafura Sea, individual Southeast Asian cities host more people than the entire northern half of Australia combined. The contrast is made sharper when you look at the numbers. Jakarta's vast metropolitan zone surpasses 30 million inhabitants, and the dense city-state of Singapore supports nearly 6 million within an area smaller than many Australian suburbs. In the north of Australia, by comparison, urban life clusters in small to mid-sized cities at best, with Darwin, Cairns and Townsville standing as the largest, and none approaching global standards of a metropolis. Australia's total population in 2025 is about 27 million. Yet of that figure, only around 2% live in the north, a figure that reflects the entire region above the Tropic of Capricorn. Darwin, the Northern Territory capital, is home to roughly 138,600 people by 2024 estimates. Cairns, on Queensland's tropical coast, has about 163,200. Further down the coast, Townsville counts around 189,300. These are not insignificant communities, but when viewed against the backdrop of a country this large, they barely register as population anchors. Together they add up to fewer than 500,000 people, a number Melbourne alone adds in growth within a single decade. The trajectories of these places have also been far more modest than their southern counterparts. Northern cities have indeed grown over the past decade, but only by single-digit percentages spread across 5 years, incremental increases that keep them sized as regional centers rather than national hubs. Meanwhile, the story looks different in the south. Australia's largest capitals have drawn hundreds of thousands of new residents in the same time span. Brisbane and Perth, for example, have each added several hundred thousand to their broader metropolitan populations in recent years, exerting a gravitational pull far stronger than anything seen in the tropical north. The result is a lopsided population map that continues to tilt heavily toward the temperate southeast. This imbalance raises questions that run deeper than demographics. It's not that people cannot live in the tropics. The nearby examples of Singapore, Ho Chi Minh City, and Manila prove the opposite. These cities sit within similar climates, yet absorb millions upon millions of new residents each decade. The northern Australian coast, by contrast, appears quiet and dark when viewed from space at night, while Southeast Asia glows as a dense urban network. The difference cannot simply be explained by accident of history or missed opportunities. It reflects a set of physical and economic boundaries imposed by the land itself. Settlement patterns across the continent have reinforced this gap. From the beginning of colonization, the largest centers clustered where water, farmland, and trade offered reliability. Southeastern Australia supplied fertile valleys, natural harbors, and a link to Britain's shipping lanes. Once these advantages took root, institutions and industries followed, anchoring growth for the long term. The north lacked comparable conditions. Soil fertility was thin, river systems unpredictable, and early attempts to establish farming settlements faltered. Mining camps or cattle stations drew temporary booms, but when resources thinned or economic tides shifted, the populations ebbed. None grew into self-sustaining cities to rival Sydney, Melbourne, or Adelaide. These structural limitations remain visible today. Darwin connects more directly by air to parts of Southeast Asia than to the rest of Australia, but such positioning has not turned it into a vast transport hub. Cairns draws millions of visitors yearly for the Great Barrier Reef, yet tourism alone does not provide the stability to lift the city's population into metropolitan scale. Townsville, despite offering a university, port facilities, and military bases, has not broken beyond its role as a medium-sized regional city. Each of these places has important functions, but their growth is capped by both environmental constraints and the centripetal pull of southern capitals. It often surprises outsiders, because on a world map, the north looks ideally placed for trade and expansion. The seas to its north are crowded with shipping lanes. Asia accounts for much of Australia's commerce. Strategic logic suggests there ought to be a major city here, funneling goods and migrants across these waters. Yet in reality, the major flows of population and capital gravitate towards Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth. Southward cities with deeper reservoirs of infrastructure, easier climates, and stronger local economies. Geography might appear to point north, but the developmental momentum of the nation still points south. Comparing directly with neighbors only emphasizes the difference. Jakarta has multiplied in size several times over since mid-century. Manila expanded into a megacity of more than 14 million. Even secondary Southeast Asian centers like Makassar in Indonesia now surpass Australian northern hubs several times over. The reason is not that climates are inherently friendlier there, but that river systems, agricultural productivity, and abundant labor supplies supported densities Australia's north never matched. Environmental capacity, more than raw proximity to trade, determined where millions of people could realistically settle. The conclusion is that what looks like an overlooked opportunity on the map is, in fact, a consistent reflection of constraints that have shaped the region for generations. Northern Australia remains dependent on specific industries, tourism, mining, defense, rather than the broad economic foundations that drive continuous migration into city life. Urban concentration endures where climate, soil, and economic opportunity overlap productively. Absent that overlap, towns remain capped in scale no matter how much infrastructure is laid down to connect them. And so in 2025, despite 2 centuries of state-building, national investment, and the lure of Asia nearby, only a sliver of Australians, around 2%, make their homes in the north. The dominant trend continues to hold. Settlement concentrates in temperate coastal belts far from the tropics. To many, this may feel counterintuitive, but it underlines the fact that map location alone never dictates urban growth. The more compelling question is why. If climate alone does not prevent large-scale settlement, and proximity to Asia has not spurred one into existence, then what has been powerful enough to hold potential megacities at bay for generations? So if it's not population pressure or climate alone, what exactly stopped a northern metropolis from forming? Geography's unforgiving advantage. On maps, the northern rim of Australia appears poised for success. An enormous coastline facing Asia, harbours with deep water, and broad expanses of land that could host a city as large as Sydney or Melbourne. But what seems promising in theory has never translated into a metropolis. Geography works against permanence here. The very features that appear advantageous, closeness to trade routes, open land, tropical seas, impose constraints that continually undercut the foundations of large-scale settlement. The north lies squarely within the tropics. Unlike the south, where seasons alternate predictably between warm summers and cooler winters, the calendar here oscillates between months of intense monsoonal rain and long stretches of dry heat. This swing between extremes dictates daily life. During the wet season, storms drop vast volumes of rain that overflow rivers, saturate floodplains, and close major roads for weeks at a time. But during the dry, water becomes scarce, landscapes brown quickly, and seasonal wetlands collapse back into arid grassland. The rhythm is relentless, and shaping a city around it is costly and complicated. One more factor has become clear in recent decades. Australia as a whole has warmed by about 1.5 degrees Celsius since 1910, but in the north that means increasingly intense rainfall events and greater cyclone strength projected into coming decades. The climate is tightening its grip rather than loosening it. Infrastructure here must be built with constant threat in mind. Roads buckle under monsoonal floods, bridges demand frequent reinforcement, and electricity lines face repeated storm damage. Cyclones cut swaths across the coast with ferocious winds, damaging ports, storage yards, and housing. Insurance premiums soar in these exposed areas. If the weather eats roads and homes, how could a city ever be stable here? Even with significant investment, projects become defined by defense and repair rather than daily civilian growth. A clear case is Darwin's new ship lift, a facility designed to service naval and commercial vessels. It reflects how strategically important the North is to Australia's future, but also how costly it is to anchor heavy infrastructure here. The Northern Territory government is backing it with $215 million, alongside up to $300 million, in concessional loan support from the federal government's NAIF. This scale of funding exists not to catalyze a sprawling new metropolis, but to make maritime operations survivable in a place where geography does not cooperate. The natural setting compounds these pressures. Large sections of coastal North Australia are flat, low-lying floodplains or mangrove zones reaching far inland. Building in them means either draining wetlands or raising ground surfaces, both expensive undertakings. The safer patches of elevated land are widely dispersed rather than forming a continuous base for expansion. Southern cities gained a foothold because they rose above river flood zones and expanded on consistent surfaces. The North offers little of that continuity. Everyday life in this environment also places a drag on growth. During the wet, extreme humidity and high heat lower outdoor productivity and raise health risks. Air conditioning is not optional but essential, pushing up living costs further. Large tropical cities elsewhere in the world overcame such disadvantages because millions of workers arrived to drive port trade or factory output, allowing economies of scale to offset the burden. No tropical population boom ever came to Australia's north. Without mass labour demand, the expense of adapting to harsh climate conditions has continued falling on a relatively small population base. This contrast explains why settlement momentum favours the south. River systems around Sydney, Brisbane, or Adelaide did not disappear with seasonal shifts. While those areas face their own risks, droughts, fires, they rarely see entire transport links vanish overnight. That steadiness matters as much as proximity. International shipping lanes may pass within sight of Darwin, but consistent infrastructure has proven more decisive than location in attracting lasting commerce. Developing the North requires confronting costs that never truly end. Reinforced building codes are mandatory across cities like Darwin, Cairns, and Townsville. Developers factor in cyclone wind loading and storm surge mitigation, which raise housing costs above southern benchmarks. Businesses question whether to establish headquarters in a zone where every warehouse or office demands both higher upfront expense and higher insurance premiums. Decision after decision pulls people and capital southwards. Resource industries show this clearly. Mining operations, gas projects, and large cattle stations all function well in the tropics, but in a way that avoids building permanent communities. Fly-in fly-out rosters work far more efficiently than constructing large residential cores. Workers arrive by plane, live temporarily in camps, and rotate out. The system allows billion-dollar projects to succeed in harsh geography, but also means there is no steady workforce staying behind to build suburbs, schools, or hospitals. Tourism hints at the same dynamic. Cairns thrives off proximity to the Great Barrier Reef and surrounding rainforest, yet its peak tourist season follows the cooler, drier months. During cyclone months, visitor numbers plunge. Hotels, resorts, and tours all adjust to that flow. Enough capacity for surges in winter, but not stable enough to justify scaling into a metropolitan economy year-round. The result is a city that can sustain vibrancy at mid-size, but not leap into the ranks of major global urban centers. At every turn, the equation remains the same. Geography gives the North unparalleled access to Asia, but it binds that advantage to immense burdens. Frequent storm damage, fragile ground, demanding higher baseline costs. The balance always tilts toward caution. Where southern Australia could build on landscapes that hosted steady farming, permanent rivers, and reliable links, the north never found an equivalent footing. So although harbours lie open and land stretches wide, growth remains capped. Strategic infrastructure rises to meet national defence and resource needs, but not to seed a full-scale metropolis. Geography presses down on every calculation, residential, commercial, and governmental, making northern Australia a region of towns and regional centres rather than global-scale cities. And geography alone is only part of the picture. Even if storms eased and terrain allowed steady construction, the next question cuts deeper. What, beneath the ground itself, can sustain human settlement? Soils and survival. Land in the north of Australia might appear endless, but the real limitation has never been space. It has always been about what that land can actually provide. For vast areas, the soil beneath the surface has been eroded of nutrients over millions of years. Heavy tropical rains, arriving season after season, leach minerals down through the profile and wash away organic matter before it can build up. What remains are sandy or lateritic soils that look green for part of the year, yet lack the fertility to sustain intensive farming. The very climate that creates bursts of lush vegetation also strips the ground of what agriculture needs. In the south and southeast, early settlers found a very different situation. Temperate weather systems, river valleys, and patches of alluvial soil gave them something to work with. Wheat, dairy, fruit, and vegetables could be grown with a reasonable chance of stable yields. Irrigation networks along the Murray and Darling supported farming even during drier years, giving those colonies a foundation of food security that could scale. Surplus crops allowed towns to grow and, over time, expand into major urban centers. That link between fields and cities has always been central. Food stability underpins settlement stability. Northern Australia, by contrast, never developed that cycle of abundance. Broadacre farming failed repeatedly because production was too thin to support large populations. Instead, agriculture turned toward extensive grazing. Cattle stations covered huge tracts of land where animals could roam to compensate for sparse vegetation. It produced income and supported a pastoral economy, but it did not create dense concentrations of food to feed cities. Communities could cluster around these enterprises, yet the land could not drive the growth of a metropolis. That reality still holds in 2025. Modern agricultural science may have improved techniques, but the problem of thin soils remains. Rainfall patterns add to the difficulty. Monsoon downpours can erode topsoil in days, undoing years of land management. Farmers who attempt cropping face waterlogging in the wet, followed by moisture stress when the dry season drags on. Yields swing widely from one year to the next, keeping agribusiness investment limited. Pockets of productivity do exist. Sugarcane fields thrive in parts of northern Queensland, and tropical fruit industries cluster around better soils near rivers. But these are narrow strips rather than expansive plains. They are enough to sustain towns like Cairns and Townsville, but not the millions of people needed for a truly large city. The Australian government has put resources into changing this equation. A notable case was the Ord River scheme in Western Australia's Kimberley, one of the most ambitious irrigation projects in the tropics. Dams, canals, and reservoirs were built to capture wet season floods and spread them across farmland. Early efforts focused on crops like cotton, but insect problems and high water demands shifted production to others such as chia, maize, and horticultural exports. In more recent years, the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility has supported similar projects in agriculture and water management. These initiatives show that engineering can lift productivity and generate export crops. But they also highlight the limits. Improved harvests have not translated into metropolitan population growth. Service towns around these projects remain small, underlining that productivity gains alone do not create critical mass for urban development. Modern technology has pushed further into the problem. Fertilizer use, soil conditioning, and precision irrigation are now standard across the few viable cropping districts. Satellite monitoring, automated pumps, and data-driven applications allow farmers to adjust water and nutrient delivery with great precision. On paper, this overcomes the natural disadvantages. In practice, the costs are steep. Fertilizer inputs must be constant, pumps consume energy on a large scale, and storm damage keeps maintenance high. Naive-backed infrastructure can help, but the economics remain weighted toward high costs and low population return. Competing with the naturally fertile valleys of Victoria or the wheat belts of the West is essentially impossible. An audio-friendly way to think about it is simple. Low fertility, flood and drought swings, and high maintenance requirements add up to land that is expensive to turn into the mass farming base that big cities need. That balance has never tipped in northern Australia's favour. The human consequences of this agricultural setting are clear. In regions with fertile soil, farming families pass holdings from generation to generation, anchoring steady communities. Towns accumulate services, schools, hospitals, markets, that make them resilient. In the north, fragile returns prevent this permanence. Farms change hands frequently, industries rise and collapse with commodity shifts, and whole families leave when thin margins no longer justify staying. Without steady long-term communities, urban growth never compounds into the density seen in the south. New technologies in 2025 have not altered this pattern as much as some hoped. Modern irrigated cropping employs fewer people per hectare than traditional farming, because machines and automation do most of the work. Profit can be made, and exports can be sold, without drawing in masses of laborers or their families. That dynamic benefits agribusiness but undermines city building. Darwin adds export income through mangoes and aquaculture, and northern sugarcane continues to supply refineries. But these industries distribute wealth across relatively small populations. They do not create urban systems large enough to sustain a metropolis. Food security remains the key point. Sydney and Melbourne flourished because their surrounding regions could feed hundreds of thousands before logistics and trade networks matured. Those hinterlands lowered living costs and made large-scale settlement affordable. In the north, by contrast, residents rely on food imported from across the continent or overseas. Supermarket shelves are stocked, but the supply chain stretches thousands of kilometers. That dependency makes daily life more expensive and large-scale urban growth more fragile. A northern city would face built-in disadvantages compared to one backed by its own farms. The conclusion is straightforward. Land may seem abundant, but fertility is not. Engineering projects can boost production, and technology can close gaps, but each hectare requires continual investment. Governments have tried irrigation schemes, corporations have tested high-value crops, and technology has raised yields in small areas. Yet none of it has generated the food base that sustains a dense population. In the north, productivity supports industries, but not permanent, self-sufficient city life. This reality shaped more than just economics. It guided history. When settlers first arrived, they were looking for fertile ground and stability. What they encountered instead were soils that resisted cultivation and seasons that undermined permanence. The question is not only why today's cities cluster in the south, but why the early attempts in the north failed to grow into anything lasting.